Well, so as you know, my name is Jessica Bellamy, and I am an equity-centered information designer. That equity-centered part, I'm going to definitely show you a lot of my work to show you how that looks in action, and I'll definitely leave you with the operating definition that I work with and a few principles tied on. But that information design part, it's just about data storytelling. I'm a visual storyteller. Oftentimes I'm using statistics and numbers, but sometimes I'm using qualitative data. And just like he said, I have a design agency called GRIDS, the Grassroots Information Design Studio in Louisville, Kentucky. I've had it for almost 6 years now. It serves nonprofits and community groups, has a very inclusive business model so that a lot of folks can opt in at different levels. And I'm an alum of the Adobe Creative Residency program, which was also just mentioned, but you add the slides. I'm also a founding member of this new nonprofit called the Root Cause Research Center. And it's a grassroots-led nonprofit that allows people that are most impacted by health disparities to be investigators, not just test subjects when we are looking at the whole story of how systemic gaps happen in our healthcare system. So that's just a little about me. So there's a lot of different components of my background that come together that inform my approach. I'll definitely go into more detail in the workshop when we're talking about the application of skills, but I wanted to kind of let you know that there's a lot of things going on at work here. So as you heard, I have a lot of degrees, one of which is in graphic design, but I ended up working in research after I graduated. I worked in a psychology lab called the Neurodevelopmental Science Lab for nearly 5 years, and during that time, I had a lot of restlessness, so I did a lot of community organizing work. I was trained by some local organizations back in Louisville, like the Network Center for Community Change, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and at that time, I ended up in a project that really changed my trajectory. So there is a neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky called Smoketown. It's the oldest historically black neighborhood in Louisville. It was the only place that African Americans were allowed to live after the Civil War. And this neighborhood is actually where I grew up. This is my grandma. Hi, Grandma. My family's been in Smoketown for a very long time. My grandmother has a restaurant called Shirley Mae's Cafe there. So if you're ever in Louisville, Kentucky, she's a staple to go to. You have to go visit her. And this is also my mother. And my family has been in the neighborhood, like I said, for many years. And in 2013, 2014, about that time period, during the Obama administration, there was a piece of legislation that hit Smoketown really hard. It's called Hope 6. Hope 6 was an initiative to take public housing across the country that were seen as areas of concentrated poverty and to dismantle them to build up mixed income housing. And that was supposed to be a way to really push economic things in these neighborhoods. Well, when that happened to Smoketown and public housing went down, there was a lot of changes and shifts. We ended up losing our community center, and we ended up getting people that I call culture vultures coming into our neighborhood that wanted to gentrify the area because it's right next to downtown, and it was a great opportunity to expand the urban core. So people were buying up parcels of cheap land everywhere, and some people were trying to rename the area to the Creative Innovation Zone, to attract, millennials or whomever, whatnot. And so an organization that I'm a part of called Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, that's me, we decided to go around the Smoketown and ask folks what their vision was. If there were going to be this increased number of dollars in the neighborhood, particularly in a neighborhood that had been divested from, that didn't have the entitlements of other neighborhoods in our city, then this was a great opportunity to hear the vision of residents that were there, what were their concerns, what were their priorities, what were assets that we could identify that could get additional resources, that sort of thing. So we created this 55-question survey and set on porches, living rooms, all this stuff, collected all this data. And we realized what we were going to create was this report that we didn't want to sit on a shelf. And I said, well, technically I have a graphic design degree. I could probably make some infographics for this, because remember, I'm working my very safe research job at this time. And they were like, sure, Jessica, but you only have a weekend to do it. I was like, great. So all the coffee, all the Monster, mixed both of them, not good for your heart. Don't do it. I'm a poster child for that, okay? And I made some infographics for the work and designed what the layout and aesthetic was going to be for our report. Well, when we released it, we knew that we wanted to put it in the hands of policymakers, of people that were developers, so that they could hear the voices of Smoketown, because Smoketown was not an empty neighborhood just to be changed and molded. But what ended up happening in practice was that we were actually arming residents. We gave every resident a copy of the report, and it completely changed the way that they were able to talk about their issues, the way that they were able to argue for amenities like public trash cans, which the council member had denied and said, you don't need public trash cans. Here's a million reasons why we can't do that and why that's not a concern. Well, now residents had data that showed what littering looked like and what streets were used the most and so forth and so on. And so I realized that we had kind of created this weapon that made me feel extremely I don't know, I just felt good. I felt whole to see data in action and mobilized by people that could use it the most. And so that's why I created Grids nearly 6 years ago. I completely quit my safe job, and I saved a nest egg and started this business, not knowing how good it would really be for our city. So what I've been doing for the last 5+ years has been going into community spaces, working with community leaders, nonprofits, talking about not only information design and how communication arts can really benefit different movements, different work, but also talking about that data piece and what equity looks like around that. In my practice, it was definitely more than what a traditional designer does. I was interviewing folks and talking about design in ways where I wasn't just concerned on the usability, I was concerned a lot about the usefulness, the longevity of what some of these assets would create in community spaces. So we'll flip through some of these pictures. It's just me talking, you know, how I do. But to show you some of my work, it takes a while before I actually get to my computer with each project that I do, but when I do good work, it looks pretty good. So I'm going to show you some of those pieces. So I do things like posters on occasion that explain things like this. This shows the connection between sex education and the gender gap. I do posters like this. Martin and I have the honor of having pieces at the Adobe office in San Francisco. I was listening to his presentation. I was like, oh, this is the poster I made for them, because they had just done a whole research project around diversity's disconnect within the creative industry. And I was like, you guys need to look at this data too. I'll make something pretty. And back to this report that I just showed you, in the short term, this was definitely something that gave a lot of power to residents, but in the long term, it influenced a few other neighborhoods in our city. There's a neighborhood that's called Russell that did its own Vision Russell project because of things also happening in that area. It's another predominantly Black community right next to the urban core, right? So we inspired a whole nother project because of that. I also, of course, do many reports. But in the reports that I make, I always try to be conscious of the field that it's going into and the stigma around certain topics. This is a report that I designed around PrEP. How many people have heard of PrEP? Just quick raise of hands. Ooh, we've got a good number of hands. So PrEP is a medication that you can take orally to prevent you from getting HIV in your sexual activities. And this report I designed in collaboration with the University of Louisville. It was meant to have the target audience of healthcare providers so that we could share out some perspectives from African Americans in Louisville, Kentucky. And we decided to design it in this way because we wanted to counterbalance the idea that HIV is a death sentence. So we wanted to make a narrative around resilience as first and foremost with our aesthetic choices. And when we were going through this work, we realized from talking to African Americans as well as healthcare providers themselves that there were a lot of biases that that needed to kind of be disclosed and talked about in that space. And number one thing is that, of course, like a lot of healthcare providers are very aware that HIV is more prevalent in the African American community, but there's a lot of assumption that that means that African Americans are indulging in more risky sex behaviors. That's not true. The difference between black folks and white folks as far as our sexual behaviors, or as far as HIV is concerned, is that black people are less likely to get tested because of our relationship with the healthcare industry. And so we started talking more about stigmas. We started talking about what spaces need to look like. We talked about homophobia, transphobia. We talked about the education and messaging that's used. We really wanted the recommendations of African Americans to be adopted by healthcare providers so that they could transform the way that they're working so that people felt comfortable to engage with them. Does that make sense? Cool, 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 tight, tight, tight. I'm gonna flip through a couple more slides from that report. I also do digital reports. These are 2 examples of reports I've done with the National Coalition on School Diversity. On the left is a research brief, and the right is a policy brief. Those are generally going out to either education advocacy folks, policymakers sometimes, but a lot of times people that just want to change the way that their school system's working. So that's why they really wanted to have more visual components for folks that may not have the time to sift through a 96-page document. Let's kind of make some one-page explainers that people could easily reference in the work that they're doing. Speaking of one-page explainers, of course, I still make a lot of pieces that are specifically for community organizers. A few years ago, back in 2017, I teamed up with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth again, and we did the People's Guide to the Budget. The Louisville budget is over 300 pages long, and it's completely boring and terrible. But we really wanted people to know what was in that document, especially with how it talked about the ways that we were divesting and investing in specific neighborhoods over another, how we talked about affordable housing and what was being funded, what wasn't, and as far as public safety was concerned, because we were giving over 70% of our multi-million-dollar budget to police alone, which is a pretty big number. So what we did was we created this report, which is, it's actually a series of one-page explainers that organizers are able to use. And in that moment of when we created it, it was great because it gave a lot of call to actions if people didn't feel like they aligned with what our budget was doing. But in the long term, it ended up creating a ordinance that allowed a longer period of time for which people can intervene with their council people before the next budget is accepted. 3 different instances where participatory budgets were created by council members or government projects so that residents could choose how money was spent. And there was actually a position created within Metro government that just focuses on participatory budgeting and how we can grow as a city with that in mind. That's a lot of impact from one report. I'm just saying, like, this was made in 2017 and it's still affecting our city. Here's some more examples of some one-page explainers that I've created. This one I did for the American Heart Association. This one I did for the Louisville Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I do presentation material. I've done medical illustrations. And I also, of course, do web infographics. I'll talk about this one in more detail tomorrow in the workshop because this project informed a lot of my conscious and responsible design principles, which I'll note in the workshop. Because this was a project that was 100% funded by my organization, GRIDS, and it just talks about how incarceration in Kentucky affects families and children in particular. And the review board for this project was massive, which is, I know, every designer's nightmare, design by committee. Well, to do work equitable, it's really important. So I had organizations that directly dealt with families affected by incarceration or children affected by incarceration. I had parents that were formerly incarcerated, and I had adults whose parents were formerly or currently incarcerated. And there was so much good happening in that design process that I can't wait to talk about tomorrow. I also do motion infographics. Okay, yeah, there's playing. Some of these are from the Designing from the Margins series. This is predominantly a social media series that I definitely wanted to create so that I could highlight some of these intersections between people of color and design in general. these specific pieces, like this one has to do with ethnomathematics, because there are whole cultures in Africa that use math in the way that they design their cities, the way that they do their architecture of their homes, their divination practices, their worship practices, and it even goes down to the way that they braid their hair, because the hair braid is actually a mathematical equation. What? I know, right? It's pretty impressive. In this space, I also talk about things like the Black aesthetic and creative unrest. I go into all sorts of different details that you can definitely dive into on social media. Or if I just see you later and you're like, play me one of your videos, you know, well, we'll play one of the videos. Why not? We'll do all that stuff. Let's keep going forward. Of course, I'm a Trekkie, so you know I had to talk about Star Trek and civil rights. It had to happen. It was bound to happen. You can watch that video, too, on YouTube. And I've been able to, of course, use motion infographics in my client work. This was part of a project that I did with Adobe, because they did come up with that report last year that had to do with how diversity is affecting the creative industry. And because of this work that I've been doing for the last almost 6 years, I've had the privilege of going to different conferences, of course, and different universities to talk about it. And from all these conversations with folks like y'all here in the room, I develop even more pieces. The workshop tomorrow is one of the key drivers of how I create for other creatives. I've created tools like the Infographic Wheel, which helps you choose an infographic layout based on data characteristics, because I realized I was constantly telling people, break out of the prison of just, I don't want to say just prison because I don't want to diminish that. Break away from just pie charts and bar graphs. You can do it. But I realized not everyone has this huge repository of potential layouts in their mind, so I started creating tools like this, which evolved into this one, which has 50 potential layouts. We'll be working with it tomorrow. And of course, it inspired a lot of play. I've even passed it to some of my colleagues that do UX design so they could work with their students. And I've done a couple of other workshops that were definitely non-traditional, but very fun and informative if people are interested in working with data. I'm going to give you my definition of equity because I've said it 1,000 times, and I think it's such a grounding principle that a lot of folks use the term, and I think it's just important to talk about. So how many people have heard of the word equity in a social justice sense? You've been saying it the whole presentation. It's true. Great job. So how many people have seen this visual, this illustration? Because it's the most common visual that's used to talk about the difference between equity and equality. So this illustration has been used by not just creatives, but teachers use it, like so many different fields use this illustration to talk about equity. But it's actually outdated. What? I know. So there was a piece that came out last year by a person with the pen name Sippin' the Inequity, which is the greatest pen name I've ever seen in my life. And this article was very, very popular and went viral pretty quick. I shared it in my network, and I got a mixed review from folks. Some folks got it and was like, oh my gosh, I've been working the wrong way for years. And I was like, I felt the same way. But some folks were very confused about what this person was saying. So that's why I designed some visuals to better explain. So let's talk about what's wrong with this initial illustration. So the basic story is that you have these 3 children who love baseball. It's their favorite game. It's their favorite game. But of course, child labor laws being what they are today, they don't have money, so they cannot get into the baseball game. They have this barrier, a fence. Was that this? Did that rattle? I don't even know. But you have this barrier, a fence. So if we were thinking, not outside the box, but inside the box, to give them all a resource, if we gave them a resource, and everyone got the same proportion, it would look something like this, where you have the first kid who was really tall, who kind of didn't need a box, have a box. Now he can see way over. He can probably see all the way to the concession stands and see that there's hot dogs being sold for $1.40. And then you have the second kid who 1 box is just right, and the third kid who with 1 box still can't see over the fence. So when you reallocate your resources, and that's what equity is, reallocating the resources to put the resource where the need is the greatest, this is how it's demonstrated. This is what equity looks like as opposed to equality. Well, the problem with this illustration is the different sizes of the children. When we make these children different sizes, we're actually making the shorter kids more needy, inherently needy, that these kids are somehow inept, They are without. They are lacking in some way. They don't have the ability to reach their full potential. That's why they need help, which is rooted in white supremacy. That's what Sipping the Inequity was trying to get at. When we make these kids different heights, we're actually building in this power dynamic that's very toxic for the way that we look at the world, and it's toxic when we intend to work in communities. Does that make sense? Cool. So I redesigned it. I just did 2 kids because, 2 kids. So when we reimagine these kids as being the same height, there's a principle that we have to understand internally. And it's a principle that I actually learned when I was in training to become a community organizer. And that's that everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole. Everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole. We're going to say it. I am. Creative, resourceful, and whole. Oh, y'all just did it all by yourselves. Yes. I am. Some days we might not feel our best, but we are still always creative, resourceful, and whole every day. And everyone around us is the same. When you start at a place like this, when working with others, it changes the dynamic. It changes the way that mutual learning happens. It changes the power of the work. Starting there allows everyone's experiences to be validated and legitimized. It allows people to be not only the subject matter expert of what they've taken in and what they have to contribute, but also of their skills. So when we reimagine the kids at the same height using our principles, we have the same story. Kids that love baseball, of course, still have the same barrier. But what happens when we keep the problem with the system? It looks like this. See how some people might have greater opportunity to reach their full potential and others might have less. When we focus on the problem being within the system's in crisis, rather than putting the crisis within the individual, we're allowed to work more effectively, less wasteful efforts in there, and we are not being complicit or continuing to proliferate stereotypes, bias, or just continue to lean on our blind spots, right? So this is what the new model looks like. We're fixing the problem with the system. So, what is equity? It's about creating an opportunity for all to reach their full potential by addressing systemic oppression. How do you do that, Jessica? Funny story. So you do that by being considerate, which means analyzing and evaluating recursively your work and how it goes out into the world. You do that by being cooperative, which means you're bringing lots of respect and dignity to the space where everyone is an equal subject matter expert. You're doing that by being inclusive, because half the time when you think about the people most impacted by the work that you're doing, those folks are probably not at the table, and they're crucial for the conversation, because that's where we get our root causes, that's where we get our realistic solutions, that's where we get so much. I'll definitely dive into that more tomorrow. We do that by being accountable, which means taking responsibility for what we're making and how it affects others. And we do that by being flexible, because we can't always have the foresight to do no harm, but we can have the integrity and the agility to do better. Does that make sense? Cool. So I wrote this piece not too long ago called Weaponizing Truth, a Spirited Analysis of Movement Science and Design. I'm probably going to retitle it because in the culture that we're living in today, talking about weapons is, I want to take it out. But I said a lot of good stuff in it because a lot of times when I meet designers, they talk about how they're user-centered or human-centered, but that's only part of the story. When we focus on that micro context of the user and the client, we completely forget about the whole world. Because the world that we're living in today has a lot of stigma and stereotypes and other things that continue to eat at people's existence and their ability to actually reach their full potential. And so when you look at the macro context, it's really more about analyzing your work and seeing whether or not it's complicit with that. It's trying to remove those blind spots that we all have as individuals. I also like to always talk about Natasha Iskander when I talk about equity, because she is an amazing professor from NYU Wagner, and she wrote another kind of controversial piece that came out last year that was very popular. It was in the Harvard Review and then republished in FASTCO. But the piece talked about a lot of different things, and she stressed the importance of working collaboratively as a designer, because it's true, like I said, you can't get past your own blind spots as an individual. You can't get past your own bias. You can't get past your own political pressures and pressures that you feel from maybe the client. That's why it's so important to work collaboratively. And when we do that, when we work collaboratively, we're actually able to break past our very rigid view of potential solutions, because as an individual, we see things only through our own frame of reference, and so we're not able to tap into all possibilities, and that's natural. We're a very social being, being human beings, and that's part of it. We have to work together to find the best solutions for every scenario. It's hard, it takes time, but it's doable. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you so much for your time.